Hey everyone, welcome to GOAT. Today we start a new playlist which is called Viewer Questions Answered. What does that mean? Well, I got this awesome question from a viewer. I have a form where the user types a string. This is used to print out sales tags. I have buttons that open a report that uses that string. There are 4 different report options. I would like to hide or gray out the buttons that should not be used based on the string length because some tags are too small to accommodate the entire long string. How can I do this? Thank you so much. This is from Luis Kressler 7586. I hope I got your name right. And we had a bit of a conversation here and I decided, hey, let's go ahead and turn this into a video. So let's get started. First, let's boil down what that question really entails. How do I toggle access form availability? So toggle means make visible or invisible or enable or disable. We're going to do something to let the user click or not click a button based on an input on that form. I hope I have this correct. We didn't share any screenshots, but this should give you a pretty good idea of how to handle this. Now with this video, I'm going to go over basically beginner and pro methods of how to pull this off. The beginner methods are going to be very, very simple. However, if you want to differentiate your Access database from beginner coders, go ahead and keep watching and you'll see some pro methods to make this really work a lot better. So first, let's just get a setup of the problem. Again, now this is a form I drafted up. I have no idea if this is what Luis's form actually looks like, but I'm pretty sure I have kind of a pretty good idea. So here we have a text description box or text box that the user can input in a certain description, and based upon the length of that description, one or more of these buttons may disappear or reappear or enable or disable, so they'll toggle their availability. So for instance, I've got some very simple code running, so if I put in a word test, I can click all 4 of these. Now, according to the description of the problem, each one of these buttons would open a report. We're not going to get into Access reports because that's a much longer video, but you can see right here on this short description that all of these buttons are available. But what happens if I type in something longer? You'll notice the 120 labels disappeared because I've got encode. Well, if this is longer than 10 characters, get rid of the 120 option. So how do we do that? So first, let's go over the beginner way we would code something like this, and then we're going to take it to the next level or 2 or 3 and learn some really pro methods of how to make this form work for the users. Okay, so first let's look at the very basic code. So what I did is on this text description, so you're going to see some stuff that you don't see on the screen, so hide your eyes. I went to the after update procedure of that text description box and I typed in this code. So I gave myself a long integer variable, ldesc. That's the same as if you type this. This is the shortcut way to do that, ampersand. And I set the description equal to the length of this text description box. Now I use this NZ here. You always want to look for NZ. This is an Access thing. Most Excel people don't have to deal with NZ or null. I've got a whole video on that because NZ can be your worst enemy, but I always check for it. So basically this means if they haven't typed anything in the text description box, it's a double quote, which is blank. So, and then I'm going to pull the function length of the string. So you can see one of my earlier videos where I talk about string functions in Access. len is one of them. So basically I'm going to set this integer value equal to the length of how many characters are in this text box. And then I do a simple check. If this variable is greater than 10, then the command 20, which is this right here, visibility equals false, otherwise it equals true. So for instance, let's test this out again. Test, that's 4 characters. All of these are visible. This is more than 10 characters. Notice the 120 disappears and I only can click the 30, 60, 90. So how can we make this more pro? Where you may have already seen part of a preview as I showed you the form design. The first thing, it may seem very simple, but I want to give the user very simple instructions in case we have new users that use this form, they don't know exactly what's going on. So I've enabled the labels on this form. So now we have enter description, and I always try to start my labels where I want them to do something with a verb, with an action word. So enter description. Okay, so test, and then click report. Oh, that's pretty easy. 60. Testing this. I go to click 120 and it disappears. So immediately we're running into a problem already, a potential problem, where a user may be confused. Why did my 120 disappear? Because I used this length of description. Well, let's do some improvements. So the first thing, or another thing we can do besides the labels that tell the user what to do in each section, is we can put some little reminder labels next to these buttons, or maybe we could even add it to the caption to the button themselves, telling the user how many characters are allowed for each button option. So here I have 4 labels, up to 10 characters, 1 to 15, 1 to 25, 1 to 35. So the larger label you have, the more characters you're allowed, from 1 to 35. Seems pretty good at first. How do we pull this off in code? Well, let's look at how you wouldn't do it. So looking at my code, we remember this first part here where I checked for a greater than 10, and then I made this button, command 120, either visible or invisible based upon whether the length of that string was greater than 10. So how would I check for a 15? Well, you might think this would work. So I could do the check for 10 and then I could do the check for 15. So if the description's greater than 15, then I make the 90 and 120 invisible. Otherwise, if we're not greater than 15, we do this. So do you think this code will work? So I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. Pause the video if you want to think about it. So let's try it out. So I have this test string here, 12 characters. This is actually 12 characters long. Now, if I look at the code, I might think, oh, well, it's greater than 10, so 120 should disappear, but I should have 90 available. But my code is faulty. So what happened is first it checked for greater than 10 and it was greater than 10. So it made 120 visibility false. But then it tested greater than 15. It's not greater than 15, so it made visibility 120 true along with 90. So this is some really funky code. It's not going to work, and it's actually going to get way confusing as we assess multiple criteria. It's just going to get really hard to understand. Now see, this works because we're greater than 15. So it ran this block of code and then it ran this block of code. But this code is going to get really hard to follow. So let's look at how we would greatly improve this code. Okay, so let's look at some improvement to this code. So this may look really scary over here if you're a new coder, but it's actually quite easy to understand. So I have my long description as before, ldesc, my long integer. But I've given myself 4 Boolean variables, B30, B60, B90, and B20. Pretty simple. You kind of know what they relate to. Now, by default, remember, by default, a Boolean is false. So we're going to get the length of description as before. So we get that integer value of how long this is. And then we do this. I say, okay, if the length is less than or equal to 35, then B30 equals true. If the description is less than or equal to 25, then B60 is true, 15 for B90, and 10, etc. And then I go look at the 4 command buttons here, command 30, command 60, command 90, command 20, and I set the visible property equal to that Boolean. So remember, by default it's false, so it's only true if it meets this condition. So here's how we assess all 4 buttons. We can give ourselves multiple criteria, and then we can easily set this. Now I could, instead of doing visible, I could say me.command30.enabled equals false or true. I chose to go with visible just so the user isn't confused, because they'll see a button that's not available and they're like, why can't I click this button? What happened? There's something wrong with the form. If we make it invisible, they're less likely to think that. They can say, oh, okay, that's not visible. So this is how you would assess all 4 of those buttons quite easily, and you can give yourselves all kinds of ranges basically. Now, while this code works great for a few buttons, if you had a lot of buttons, let's say 20 or 30 buttons, you probably wouldn't want to do this method because it's very explicit. That's when you want to get into loops. I haven't covered loops yet, at least on this channel. Eventually I will, but that's when you would want to get into loops and do other kind of crazy things. But something like this where I only have 4 options, this code works great. It's very easy to read as a developer. Even if it's you who wrote it and you come back to this a year later, you can read this very quickly and be like, okay, I understand what's happening. So that's very important. So don't forget that you may be the one reading your own code later on. And if you write some code that's really hard to read, it's going to take you a while to kind of decode that to understand how this form works. So are we done? Absolutely not. We still have several other tricks up our sleeve. So let's look at this form again, and let's look at the behavior of this form. You generally have 2 types of users in Access. You have the people that love to click and the people that love the keyboard, and they love to tab through controls. So let's look at this form here. You'll notice that I do have a hover option set for my button. So I've set a hover color of white. I personally like to invert the font color and the back color with the 4 color, the hover 4 color and the hover color. So instead of auburn on the back and white font, I just invert that. So that's my hover options. However, a lot of users like to tab through. And they're actually faster. They don't like to use the mouse. Now notice when I tab through here, it's really hard to tell on the screen, even if you zoom in, where exactly you're at on the form. Now, Access is outlining these buttons, but it's really hard to see. So how can we improve that? So there are 2 methods for text boxes and buttons that we want to pay attention to, and they're called on-got focus and on-lost focus. And they basically mean exactly what they say. So when this text box is focused, that is the active basically control, or when this command button has focus. Now again, that's different than hover color. When that command button is barely outlined, it has focus. And so for instance, if you hit space on your keyboard, generally that will activate that button. So when that button has focus and when it loses focus, we want to highlight that. So how can we do that? So let's look at this code here. Now there's an easier way to do this. It involves object-oriented coding, which was a lot more advanced than this video. So I did it explicitly. But again, this is for just 5 options. It's not that bad. We can do this explicitly. So how did I get this? So first, what I want to do is I want to set my buttons to the normal color. So for instance, I have my 4 buttons here. They're the normal color. Now I want to know the code of that color. So I can do question mark, which is the same as debug.print. So question mark is just a shortcut. I want to do the screen.activeControl, so that's the actively highlighted, or selected rather, control on this form, .back color. Now you may see here that my quick help is not giving me the back color option. That's because some controls don't have a back color. So it's not going to tell you, yes, you can absolutely choose it, but we know from our properties for a button and a text box that they do have a back color property. So I'm going to debug.print this back color. So this code right here, this is a long integer, is the code for this button's back color. So now let me change it to one of the colors that I want to highlight it as. So now let's choose the color I want this control to be when I highlight it. So let's go over here to format, and let's say I don't want to change the font color, I just want to change the highlight color. Let's say we make this the highlight color. So we go back to our debug.print and we get that code. So this is the highlight color. I can even write myself a little note here, normal color. So what you do is now let's change this back. We're just gonna there we go. Now let's change this back. So what do I do? For each of these buttons, I want to go to the on-got focus and on-lost focus. So when it gets focus, I want to change that back color to my highlight color. Now this is a slightly different code, but this is the highlight color. And then when it loses focus, I want it to change back to the normal color. So this was the normal back color. And then I do the same for this text box up here. So each of these buttons has code behind the on-got focus event and the on-lost focused event. So let's see how this operates now. You'll notice that my text box is a light blue, and as I tab through, my buttons highlight beautifully. So now it's much easier to see for the end user where exactly they're at on the form. Pretty cool, huh? And now notice this is different than the hover color. I went with an inversion of back and front, but my highlight color with the keyboard is different. You can choose to do the inverted color if you want. I chose something a little different in blue to indicate that I've tabbed through these buttons. And so if I were to test something and type test and then I'm on 30 and I hit space, that's like I'm activating that button. So are we done yet? Absolutely not. We're not to the pro level yet. So let's look at this form again. I hit test. I have these options here. And I can see that the criteria for each of the buttons is kind of spelled out for me. So 1 to 35, etc. However, if I'm an end user, the last thing I want to do is sit here and count my characters for this thing. Now, the code determines the character count after I update this text box, but how do I make it to where I get a real-time count of the characters? Let's find out. So here's one way you might try to improve this form. So I have a text box here with a little bit of code behind it. So this is a text box that is not enabled. So enabled equals no, locked equals no. So it looks like this on the form. And when I hit test and hit tab, it says, oh, okay, I know the character count. So let's see how accurate this is. Oh, cool. I know 17 characters. So how did I get this to work? First, I'm going to show you how I get this to work, and then I'm going to show you the problem behind it. So I went to the control source for this text box. Now, it must be a text box. You can't have a control source on a label. So this is a text box. And let me zoom in here to this. Now, what I did is I set the control source for this text box equal to the length of the text description. You have to have the brackets here. Notice the brackets here. Let me make this font larger so you can see this. So this is what it looks like, equals length. I check for my null, NZ, text description, comma, double blank if it's null, and then I close out the brackets. And that's how this works. So notice it's 0. Now notice a problem immediately. When I type the letters, it still reads 0. When I tab, it then updates. Why is that? Why do I not get a result as I'm typing? Well, there's this little quirk in Access, and this is just how it works. It's not really a quirk, it's quirky. But as I'm typing in this text box, I have not yet updated that field until I get off the text box. So this control source here is talking about the value of the field. So what do I mean by that? So let's look at this. Right now, the value of this text box, the length of it, the value of this, even though it's unbound, it still has a value, is 4 characters long. So as I start typing, we haven't yet saved the value of this text box. So over here, we're still reading 4 characters. It's not till I tab off of this text box or hit escape or something, I click somewhere else, that value gets updated, and then this box gets updated. So see what I'm talking about? So test, we're still reading the old value of 14 because we haven't assessed the new value of this text box. As soon as I get off of it, it then updates because now it's saved, even though it's an unbound field. Well, this is obviously not the best solution, so how can we improve this? Well, you might think you can improve it this way. I'm going to show you how not to do it. So we can go to this text box here. Let's go to control source. There is a property of text fields called text, and actually combo boxes too. Now, what is this? This here refers to the actual text that's being shown in the text box at the time before it has been updated. So if we change our code to this, text description.text, let's see what happens here. Look, my number is updating as I'm zooming through this text box. Well, that's kind of neat. So if I have 1 character, it's 1. And if I type this out, it's 11 characters. It works, right? No, it doesn't. Here's a little trick behind that property called text. Watch what happens when I tab away from this. Ooh, I get an error message. Why do I get that error message? That is because the .text property can only refer to the control when it has focus. So to refer to the .text in code, and the same is working here, if I put the code in my text box, the control that I'm assessing has to have focus. So in this case, as long as this box has focus, this code works. But as soon as the focus moves away from that, now this .text reference, the property .text reference, is broken because it can only refer to something that has focus. So we still haven't really solved our problem, but we're getting closer. So instead of using this text box that has code behind it, what if we give ourselves a label? And we want the label to act like this text box is acting. How do we do that? Well, notice that as I type on this box, that description was changing. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's very fast. Now remember I said a label doesn't have a control source, or maybe I didn't, but a label doesn't have a control source. So when I look at this label, I can't do the data like I can with this text box. So how am I updating this label? Well, I tie the action to an event for this box here, which is called onChange. So if I go to the onChange event procedure, here's what that code looks like. So let me move it over. What the heck? Okay, so the onChange for that text box is me.label_car_count.caption equals length of, again, I have to refer to the text. And now this will work because this is tied to the text description change event. So that means the text description control has focus. So this referring to this is no big deal. So as that text box is changed, let me move this back so we can kind of see what happens. As this undergoes change, I just update the caption of my label. Now I can get rid of this because I don't need this. And then now let's look and see what happens. See, as this changes, and if I tab over, this is a label. It's statically updated. It's not updated by a formula like the text box was. It was just static updated as I get in here and type. Too easy. So now we can get our character count very simple. This is a 14, which means I should have these. Now, are we done yet? Almost. One more thing that might be kind of confusing. So let's do test. You'll see I have all 4 buttons available. But what if I do testing this? Now, I notice I have not tabbed away from this text box yet, and I'm able to click 120. Now I shouldn't be able to click 120, and in fact, if I go to click it, it's going to disappear. Now that may confuse some users that aren't keyboard tabbers, so they like to click things. As a matter of fact, what happens if I do this? Sorry, phone call. So what happens if I do this? I had these labels disappeared and I'm like, oh wait, I wanted the 120 option. So let me back out. Okay, I should see the 120. Where's my 120? If I'm not a tabber type of user, I'm gonna get confused. Why don't I see my 120 option? Of course I hit tab, it now appears, but I didn't know that as a user. So how could we change this form around to make it even easier? So to make this a little bit easier for the user, what I've done is by default, I've hidden my report options, and then, silly phone, and then I have a view report options button here. Now the way this view options, report options button works is the same as my normal code behind my after update here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the event on click. Now this is what happens when I click, and I'm going to take this code here, which was the description after update. Now we're not going to assess the option after the update, we're going to assess the option after this click. So let's cut that code and let's just put it here in the view options. Now let me review it really quick. Okay, good to go. Now these buttons are hidden by default. So there we go. I have all 4 options. Now what happens? Check this out. See, still works. 17 characters. Now the problem is, again, what happens if if I'm a clicker, why don't I see this? Why don't I see this stuff? What's going on here? Well, let's do some cleanup. So we need to analyze the behavior of this form. When I click View Report Options, I want these to appear. However, when I get back into this text box, I want those to disappear again until the user has typed in their things and hit View Report Option again. So how do I do that? So what I'm going to do is tie that to the on got focus. So we have on got focus from earlier in the video where we gave it a cool back color, but we're also going to hide command 120.visible equal false. There we go. We're going to give ourselves code that when this got focused, we lose our options, and then we can see it here. And then the user clicks back in here, they disappear. Let's view the report options. Testing this. Even if they're tabbers and they hit the space bar, there we go. Good to go. So now we've kind of cleaned up this form and we can assess everything as needed. So boop, boop, boop. Are we done yet? Almost. Remember, to be a pro, you have to ask the what if game over and over and over. So here are some what if scenarios. What if the description is blank? Are we going to allow the user to have a blank description? What if the length of the description is greater than a particular variable? Are we going to trim that down? Or are we going to stop them? Or, I forgot one, what if the description has leading spaces? Are we going to allow that? So for instance, if I'm on this form and I do this, is that intentional, or are we going to trim that up? See my video about trim. You would basically use the trim function here if you don't want those leading spaces. Now the other spaces I believe will be automatically trimmed. Yes, they will, but the leading spaces aren't automatically trimmed. So this counts as an 11 character text field. If you run the trim on this after the update, it could be of just a 4 character. Comment below if you like this video. Thanks so much. I hope this helps. God bless. Have a great day.